Welcome back, everyone. It has been a minute. I'm feeling good to be back in the chair. Today, we're joined by Rowan Foster, who is also my missus.
That's me.
Now, I think it's better if you explain what you do, because whenever people ask me, what does your missus do? I'm like, well, she does something in the NHS with people who struggle mentally, but I don't know. So I think it's better if it comes from you.
Okay, so my actual job title doesn't really mean anything to anyone, but people who know what it is, it means something to them. But basically, I'm a lived experience professional. So my official job title is the Expert by Experience Lead for the Tier 4 CAMHS Provider Collaborative, which is the most ridiculously long name ever, and it makes a really long email signature. But what that essentially means is Tier 4 is a type of inpatient, so it's inpatient services. So when we think about mental health services, especially for CAMHS, which is the area that I work in, it kind of goes in 4 different tiers. So tier 1 is like those universal services, things like your school nurse, your GP. Obviously, you don't have a school nurse because you're a little bit too old for that now, but that's that tier 1. Tier 2 are those more kind of, it's not specialist services, but it's ones where you can't just get to it through the GP. So it might be things like 6 sessions of CBT counselling. Often that's called IAP, which is improving access to psychological therapies, but I'm not sure if it's called the same thing for children, which I should probably know.
What is CBT counselling?
CBT?
Yeah, what is that?
CBT is cognitive behavioural therapy. So it's basically a type of therapy that's around changing your thought patterns and your cognitive kind of patterns to affect the way that you behave and the way that you kind of feel about the world. So that's that tier 2 service, and that's a therapy that's used for depression, anxiety. It's pretty much the first line intervention for pretty much everyone in the NHS. The NHS has a real thing about CBT. It loves giving people CBT. It's because it's an evidence-based therapy, basically, which means that they've done studies and they've shown that it's effective. And because it's something that who's been shown to be effective in quite a short amount of time. Bigwigs at the NHS went, oh, that'll save us loads of money. Let's do that for everyone. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And so for people for whom that tier 2 doesn't work, or they have a more complex mental illness, so that could be something like an eating disorder, maybe something like psychosis, like trauma, which is my specialty, then they'll go up to tier 3, which is specialist services. So that's usually they'll see a specific counsellor. This could be for a therapy like EMDR, which is eye movement, rapid processing. Basically, it's a trauma thing that treats trauma, and DBT, which is like dialectical behavioural therapy, but all these other sorts of things, types of therapy that are specialist. If that still doesn't work, or if somebody's still too unwell for that and they need to be treated in a hospital environment because they're not well enough to be in the community, they'll go up into a tier 4 service, which is, I am doing little pyramids, I promise I'm not in the Illuminati. There's like this lovely pyramid graphic that I always think of when I'm explaining it. And that's specialist services, which are basically in an inpatient hospital. So that's where I work. I usually work from home, because I work in the commissioning part of that. So when a child within Surrey is very unwell, and they're so unwell that they need to be in hospital, this could be because, for example, they have psychosis and they're floridly psychotic, which means they're basically really, really unwell, and they're in that stage of their mental illness where they're really, hallucinating, delusional, not safe either for themselves or around other people. So they need to go into hospital to usually have their medication stabilised. And when people go into when people go into hospital, that's usually under a section. So a lot of people don't want to go into hospital voluntarily. And if somebody's under section, that basically means that they are decided by a mental health professional that they don't have the capacity to make that decision. They're not well enough to understand that they're allowed to stay out of hospital, what staying out of hospital will mean for them, and it's important for them to be in hospital. So that's tier 4. So if someone's unwell, it's my team's job to find them a bed, and my job is to go in and to basically make sure that the place where they are and the help they're receiving is the kind of help they need. And as a lived experience professional, that basically means that I use my own lived experience in mental health services, and I've been doing lived experience work for like 9 years, which, it does belie my age. I started quite young, and having that in an officially an employed role didn't really exist until more recently, and that's because the NHS has been changing things. And there's something called the NHS long-term plan that basically means that they realised that because there have been lots of, let's delicately call them fuck-ups by the NHS over time, especially about how they treat people in hospital, especially people with learning disabilities and autism, that they would have it be mandatory that people with lived experience are employed, because it's about understanding basically what service users need. And people become passionate about something either through learning about it and that professional interest, or through that personal interest. And actually, there are a lot of people who are employed within the NHS as professionals, not lived experience professionals, but professionals who went and got a degree, who have that lived experience as well. But having a lived experience role means that is the key reason why you're employed. You can't do that job unless you have that lived experience. And another part of my job, which I've been working on more recently, is around co-production. So basically making sure that the voices of these young people that I work with, that they are involved in service delivery and service development. So co-production is something that is a really big buzzword within the NHS right now, but actually it's not really done much within the NHS. Co-production in its true genuine form means the sharing of power. And it means that the people who are receiving that service, essentially, and the people who are delivering service are working hand in hand to make that service what it is. A lot of the time, it's people who design the service going to people who are using the service going, what do you think? Do you like it? If so, we'll do it. If not, you can't really do anything about it. And that's something that we're planning to change. So a lot of the things that I do within my role are working with NHS England as well. So I co-chair the national network for Experts by Experience. So, bougie, I chair that, which is really exciting. I do a lot of other work with NHS England just around strategic work, around actually shaping the way that mental health services are developed within the UK, especially within kind of when we're talking about autism, when we're talking about care experience, when we're talking about physical disability, and all these other sorts of things that I have kind of relevant, direct lived experience within, so that I can try and make things better. Really long-winded explanation, and I don't think you're going to fit that into a little explanation when someone asks you what your business does, unfortunately.
So you still go and see patients?
Yeah.
Is there a difference when you go and see the patients, or what happens when you go and meet?
So it's usually just sitting down and having a conversation with them about what's going on with them and what service they're receiving and what they're happy with and what they're not happy with. And often that's more them talking about what they're not happy with, and that's really understandable, especially if somebody is within hospital and they didn't actually want to be. If they're under section, for example, and they can't leave if they can't leave if they want to, they're probably not going to have the most glowing reviews. But a lot of my job is trying to really draw out actually what are the things that you're angry or upset or disgruntled with that we can actually change. So for example, if there's, I have this mental health professional or this social worker involved in my care and I really don't like them, can I have a different care coordinator or a different social worker? I'll go, sure. Then I'll take that back to within my team and go, you need to fix it. And sometimes they'll tell me about things that are going on which are really bad, and so I'll have to take that back and raise it. And also I'll go into their meetings, so meetings that professionals have around the young people, and say, this is what they think, this is what they want, this is what we need to do around that. And it can become quite complicated, especially because a lot of professionals don't understand who I am and what I do or why I'm there. And even though I've been in this job for 2 years, I think there's still a lack of clarity, because my job doesn't really exist many places. I'm one of the first people and one of the only people who does my job in the UK, because it's a very specific job, especially because I work in kind of one local region, so I'm responsible for all of Surrey's things, but also because it's a new job. There's something called the quality and kind of quality maturity framework, which talks about how the NHS envisions that developing and how it envisions things changing over time to embed lived experience more into the work that they do. But a lot of places around the country still aren't where they need to be and still aren't where we expect them to be, which don't like that. So we're having to go at them to make them do better, basically.
That's like a very niche.
Oh yeah.
A niche career. So how did that even come around? Like, obviously it's not well known, so they're not going to really advertise for it on Indeed or something. So how do you even get into that? So
it was something that I've been involved with since I was 14. So there are many different avenues of co-production and involvement. And as somebody who's used services, so I was involved with using mental health services. I think I started using mental health services about 10 years old, which, makes me seem really mentally stable. I'm still not, but we're working on it. And the way that that essentially worked meant that obviously I had that experience of services, and I had quite a lot of feelings about how that was going and how well it was. I was invited to an awards ceremony. I think I was nominated by one of my counsellors because they thought I was doing really well, and it was run by a council team, which at the time was called the Rights of Participation team. It's called the User Voice and Participation team now. That was my last job, actually. I ended up working with them as an employee as well. And so once I was invited to that awards ceremony, they advertised a bit about what they did. And I was like, oh, sounds like a bit of me. So I then spent the next 7 years alongside school, alongside college, alongside trying to keep myself alive, just talking with them and sitting on interview panels. I remember being about, I think I was 15, I was sitting on this interview panel. So when there was like, oh, my name's Minima and I'm the consultant psychiatrist. My name's Minima and I'm the director of Children and Family Services. I was like, hello. I'm none of those things. Don't really know why I'm here, but I would then have equal weighting within that. So it was lots of those little experiences and the focus groups that they ran, and kind of reviewing paperwork, which is my favourite thing to do because I'm a little bit of a nerd for paperwork and data collection. I was like, oh, I'm going to criticise all of their spelling and grammar. You still get me to spelling and grammar check all your posts because that is a skill set of mine, and you know it's developed through lots of practice of reading through commas, going, all of this is wrong. You need to send it back and change it. So then there was a job that came up through the User Voice and Participation team as kind of a bank role. So this was a little bit after my physical disability had kind of fully set in. When I was 18, 19, I'd had issues with my physical health my whole life, but I caught viral meningitis and basically ended up in bed for a year, which was not very nice. I was really unwell. I lost a lot of weight very quickly. And services didn't really know what was wrong with me. But after a little bit more investigation, I have a slightly better understanding of what's going on with me now. So I'm able to work more than I was. But I was employed on a bank basis and doing a bit of that work in between. And that was actually quite soon after my sister died, that I got employed into that role, which got a little bit mentally traumatizing sometimes. There was this one meeting I was in. I was sitting, and it was this, I think he was actually a lived experience professional as well, but I think he was a nurse by background. He was going there because of his autistic lived experience. And he sat there and said how autistic people are all attention seekers and how they say they're going to kill themselves and they don't. I was like, let me tell you a story about my sister and how that's not actually what happens. And that's an area of frustration that has been, it's really about breaking down those barriers and creating social change. A lot of the time people think that lived experience work is just about making services better, but actually the true genuine goal of it is about genuine social and culture change, and about making sure that a lot of these stereotypes, a lot of these perspectives, even having somebody with lived experience in the room means that professionals have to check themselves at the door. They have to think to themselves, the thing that I'm saying, the group that I'm talking about, they're in the room with me. And often professionals will say things about people who are under their services which are actually not fair and not nice. I remember this meeting I was in once where I've heard the terms like mad as a box of frogs used about, which in fairness is quite a funny word, but to use that to talk about somebody who they're taking care of or the family of somebody that they're taking care of, that's harmful. It means, how can you possibly treat someone fairly? How can you give them the care that they deserve when behind the scenes that's the things you're thinking and saying about them, and that's okay? So by having a lived experience professional in the room, my job is to challenge that and go, you can't say that. And to explain why that's wrong and why saying these things is harmful and why it hurts people. And sometimes professionals forget that, and that's something that's been a real difficult thing for me to kind of adjust to and balance with. That now I work within this field and I can almost feel the desensitization coming. And when you have little time, when you have lots of different people on your caseload, it can be really hard to remember that all of the people that you're working with and that you're treating are people with really rich lives and really rich stories that you don't really know anything about. And even though you're there and you're treating them, when you're seeing somebody within a hospital, you are knowing them and you're knowing their family at the worst moment of their life, probably. When you bump into them onto the street, when you don't know anything about what they'd be like then, you can have a guess, you can get to know these people quite well, but you will only ever get, when you're working with someone and providing a service, especially with inpatient, just this limited view about who they are and what's important to them. And so part of my job is to try and remind people actually that the people that you're working with are whole people, and sometimes they come back and work with you, so you have to be nice to them.
Do you think that your sister had a big role to play in what you do now?
Hugely. I know that she was so passionate about service change, and services letting her down and not giving her the care and the treatment that she deserved and she needed, not just because they didn't like her, but because that treatment didn't actually exist, that service didn't exist for her. Making sure that I'm involved in things like service development, I can say these things, I can bring that up, and I can make sure that they understand that some people need services that they don't have, and really acknowledging and trying to make sure those services are created. And I know that the work that I'm doing now, she would be very happy that I was doing it, and she would be doing it herself if she had been well or alive enough to do it.
So I think me and you have very different views on how to put it, censorship of the words you use. I'm a more of a believer of, I don't think you have the right to say to people you can't speak like this. Like I'm a massive believer in freedom of speech. Like, I will never delete hate comments off my Instagram or TikTok or whatever because I believe in freedom of speech. It's just a line, like you have cancel culture and stuff like that, especially in the industry that you're in, especially like talking in a negative way about people you look after is heavily frowned upon. I'm not saying it's right, but I don't think it should be gone like at the extent of what it is to be like cancelled and things like that just for voicing some words.
I think that's really understandable, and we do have different perspectives on it, but there's also a lot of feelings that we share about it. I think that there's a lot of moral grandstanding when it comes to language, and I helped write a report on kind of ableism and language, and that was for the council. And there's a very different thing between somebody saying the words that they say and speaking the way they speak at home, or even in a closed team meeting, versus speaking about something in a multidisciplinary meeting where lots of people can hear. And it's about how that affects the care that they're delivering. And it's about how, when you hold responsibility for someone's everyday life and all these other sorts of things, and you hold a lot of responsibility over them, you have a responsibility to make sure that what you're doing and the way that you think about them and the way that you talk about them is mindful of that. Because if everyone in that room gets kind of stirred up into a frenzy about what they think and what they want and the words that they use, that could hurt people, that could kill people actually, if it's used in the wrong way. One of the examples, so for example, borderline personality disorder, right, is something that's extremely heavily stigmatized within the NHS. And it's not just about the words that they use, it's about the intentions that they're conveying. It's about what actually the consequences that the words they say have. And there's a really big difference between that within a closed space and that within an open space. What you say, what someone says to their other colleague, in front of the water cooler, it can be frustrating, but it's about the underlying feelings and the culture that is but often there's moral grandstanding around this. People want to criticize language because it makes them feel powerful. It goes, I'm right, you're wrong, and therefore I hold this power over you. Or, well, I've changed this thing now, I've changed this stigma now because I've changed your language, and that's not true. Cancel culture, I have an issue with simply because it doesn't allow people to learn and allow people to grow. When somebody says the wrong thing in that meeting, you don't go, by the way, you're wrong and I'm going to fire you. That's not what happens. It's not about punishing people. It's about developing the understanding. It's about asking questions. Why do you think that? Why is that language that you feel like you're using? What's the underlying stigma or feeling that you have there that's causing you to behave like this? Is this something that's just normalized within your trust? Is that an issue? And there's, again, language holds a lot of power. I think it might be something like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is getting into my linguistics thing at the moment, which is about how languages have different words depending on how they conceptualize things. So it's something like the Inuits have like 30 words for blue, whereas we have like 2, right? Because yes, and that might be completely made up, by the way. I don't know that the Inuits do actually have 30 words for blue, but you understand the point I'm making. The way that we think influences the language that we use, and they have a very interdependent relationship. By changing language to some degree, you can't change how people think by changing their language. There's something called the euphemism treadmill, which basically is that if you have a concept that's pejorative, so bad or offensive, it doesn't matter what word you call that, eventually that word's going to become offensive because that underlying conceptualization of that thing as being pejorative will still hold. It's why special needs has then moved to additional needs, and before that it was mental retardation and all these other sorts of things, and that over time those terms which were actually medical and that were euphemistic have become offensive words because they still have that underlying association. While that concept is held as bad by society, it doesn't matter what nice word you put on it, it will still become a bad word, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it goes through generations, as it were.
Okay.
So I think other people that your patients that you're dealing with of the sort of the current generations, so not like my generation.
Well, they're all under 18, so I
Yes.
hope so.
Yeah, so the words we would use around sort of mental health or something like that, back when I was at school, would be like banned or very frowned upon now.
I guess there's a difference between what someone's using to describe their own experience or talk about things. And again, there's a really big difference between a professional and informal setting.
Yeah, 100%.
But I guess it depends what word you're speaking about. I'm not trying to get you cancelled, Oliver. But,
Oh no, I don't mind. I don't mind. But I know you.
it depends on
I
the
know
word.
you always pick me out if I'm saying, look at this retard. Like you
Yeah.
can't even understand the eye roll that just happened there and just caused an earthquake. But that word, I don't see that as a bad word. I don't know if you ever heard of this situation. This guy in America, Navy SEAL, called Jocko Willink, and he wrote a book. And in the book, one of his characters he wrote down was retarded, and the publisher would not publish the book because it had that word in. And he was like, "Well, what do you mean? I'm saying what he is."
Yeah. So that word has a really long history. The amount of people who have had that word used to deny them rights, genuinely, because we're talking what that word means. It refers to people with learning disabilities. And people don't always realise that, but that's where the term comes from. And the amount that word was the justification for people to be locked in institutions. And even now, within schools, having that if you have a learning disability, having those words used against you, hearing those words can cause you such pain and such difficulty, and can be actually really upsetting. And you can go, oh, it's a snowflake's being upset about it, because I can see it in your little eyes going, oh, whatever. But when those words have caused harm over time, then, and again, it's about censorship. Yeah, censorship, but also it's about being nice to people.
Yeah.
And, having
it's
that
definitely being
consideration.
nice and being morally right. But I think it's down to parents a lot in the beginning where the problem arises to teach their kids that, if you have got learning difficulties and you are a bit spicy, then people are going to pick you out on that, and you just prepare them for that. When I went to school for the first time, my mum sat me down and said, look, you're ginger, you're different, people are going to call you out on it, but it's just fine, it's just words. And that sort of helped me when, everyone gets the ginger thing at school if you're ginger.
I'm saying this with so much love, Oliver. But being ginger is not the same as being disabled.
It's a difference, and you're being
it is a
discriminated for being different.
Yeah, you're visibly different, and people get picked out. But wouldn't it be really nice if, instead of just having to tell you that you're going to have to deal with shit and you can't, and you just have to deal with it, people could just stop being shit?
True, but you're not going to build up a character of yourself and sort of stand up for yourself further down the line if everyone's always been super nice to you. You've never experienced any bad, no one's ever said anything bad towards you, or bullying or anything like that.
There's a difference between children growing through adversity and children being traumatized. And as
I think it's a fine line.
Yeah, it's actually not that fine a line. I think when we talk about the children going through adversity, it helps them grow because they can get over it, right? It's like you put an obstacle in the way that they can challenge and they can achieve and they can reign over. But when it comes to something like a learning disability, you can't just get over that. It will be with you your whole life. It will affect the way that you live life. It could, again, result in you being locked in hospital for many years, and that's a problem that has happened. And it's something called assessment and treatment units, where people have had just learning disabilities and they have been locked away and abused for decades. Genuinely. And
yeah, I've
so
seen it on the news.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, you have the hospitals that are like secretly abusing all their patients.
And if you go back enough years, then that was common practice. You know, people who had learning disabilities were seen as less than human. You know, that they didn't deserve rights, that they didn't deserve to be loved, that they were locked away and denied the things that they deserve human rights to. And when you have that history, and when you have, that's not something that that someone can get over. It's a little bit like being autistic, which obviously I'm autistic, and that's not something that's ever not going to be the case for me. That's not something I can reign over and achieve. It's not something that I can change. And and I will face challenges throughout my whole life because of that. And although I can develop coping mechanisms, I can develop things that make it easier to go through the world as an autistic person, those can really affect my health. They could really affect my opportunities in life, you know. One of the key experiences of being autistic is that everyone hates you when you're a kid, and you don't really know why, and you're making all these social mistakes and no one tells you what you're doing wrong. You have no idea what you're doing wrong, and so you go through your entire childhood feeling broken, and that's something that fucks a child up. And that's why many autistic children really struggle in later life. You know, the outcomes for mental health, for jobs and all these other sorts of things for autistic. And when you go into the adult world, that doesn't get better. People will still hate you for some reason because you've done something wrong and you've not even known that you've done it wrong. And things like this, you know, it's not, adversity is character building, but something like, and although that adversity can bring you, yes, you know, and I'm not regretful. I love being autistic. I think it brings me a lot of value as well to my life, but it's still brought me really significant challenges. And at the same time as, yes, that has given me coping skills and given me insight into things that I perhaps wouldn't have had otherwise. And of course, it's one of the reasons that I do the job that I do now. I think sometimes the question that it almost starts to become is it worth it?
Yeah, I understand that, but do you think if your parents told you, like, you're going to struggle with this and, like, feeling this way, it's, like, normal for you, and explained it to you, do you think you would have gone through your childhood differently?
Well, probably would have been nice to have not abusive parents, to be honest with that. And that's another. But also, especially with things like autism, you don't always know. A lot of girls especially are diagnosed later in life. And so you go through this entire childhood feeling broken and you don't know why, your parents don't know why either. So yes, ideally, for someone to be diagnosed really early and for it to be explained to them that, yes, things are going to be harder for you. That's great and that's really helpful. But it doesn't remove the adversity entirely, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it will never truly. It will kind of
make things easier.
It'll prepare you for life.
Yeah, and when we think about trauma in itself, you know, I think you started reading Body Keeps the Score recently.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we talk about who develops PTSD and who develops serious responses to traumatic situations, you know, there's 3 people who can go through the exact same trauma and come away with completely different emotional responses and completely different mental health responses. And there's lots of different factors that come into that. But having a secure base, having support around you means that when you go through these traumatic experiences, then you have people to support you at home. You have all these other things that can help mean that those traumatic experiences don't disable you, but they just, you know, that they impact you, but they don't lead you to be a shut-in for 20 years, or they don't end up with you being sectioned in a mental health hospital. But unfortunately, where there's smoke, there's fire. And often when somebody, especially with autism, often someone's parents are autistic, if they're autistic. It's not always, but there is a hereditary aspect to it. And those parents might be completely undiagnosed, have gone through all that trauma, have had no justification or explanation as to why, and then become very mentally ill or very nasty people because of having faced that. So it gets messy, basically. It's all a big, big mess.
Because one of your parents autistic or both?
Both.
Both.
Well, neither of them were officially diagnosed, but I'm telling you, yeah, and they both acknowledge. And I think my father's kind of semi-diagnosed. I haven't really spoken to him for enough years to have a clear understanding of that. And my mum probably almost is realistically, and both of my siblings are as well.
I remember you talking about this to me before. It's not PTSD, is it
CPTSD.
PTSD?
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean?
So CPTSD is called complex PTSD. And so when we think about PTSD, it's about something that is traumatic. Yeah. So that could be something like, basically something that risks your life, your limb, or your sense of safety and belonging. So the threshold for that is different in children, because when you're a child, your world is very small. And one of the key things that can cause CPTSD in children is things like abuse, things like neglect, unsafe parents, sexual exploitation, all these other sorts of things. So I have CPTSD, and that's because I'm a survivor of child abuse. Yay! I also went into the care system, and that was probably the main reason for my CPTSD. And the way that I like to explain it is like, I mean, you're a tree surgeon, so this tree analogy is quite good for you, actually. It's like how a tree grows, right? And how for someone who has PTSD, it's almost like, you know, you grow in this certain way and you get really shocked, or even people without PTSD, you know, you'll grow in this certain way, you'll go in this, because in response to your environment, you know, it's the same with the sunflower. It'll rise looking towards the sun. And the entire way that I have grown and developed has been influenced by trauma. And so when I go into the real world, my body, my brain, my way of working, all my coping mechanisms, I have this really great skill set that I can't use for anything like that. The entire way that I've developed and way that I've learned to function has been just because in the context of a traumatic situation, I was experiencing significant trauma from birth up to the age of 14, and considering the fact that I lived in a children's home until 18, and then my sister died, and then I got physical, all these other sorts of things. And the thing with complex PTSD is that it builds on top of itself. So you get the same symptoms as PTSD, like flashbacks, you know, sense of being unsafe, mood swings, all these other sorts of things. But it can cause more significant emotional dysregulation, attachment difficulties. It can be very difficult for people with CPTSD to maintain healthy relationships, actually. So, you know, lucky you, you know, to be fair. I've been in therapy since I was quite young. And actually I was in therapy while I was being actively abused, which, not gonna lie, that was a bit of a mindfuck, especially because I was receiving anger management therapy. So I was a very, very angry child, and that was because I had no way to express what was happening to me or what I was feeling, and I was imitating what was happening to me as well and what I'd seen, and so it all got very messy. And having CPTSD it's not something that can be cured per se, and it's because, you know, that entire way that I've grown is in response to that trauma. And there's not really another way for me to know how to be. And a lot of healing as somebody with CPTSD has been much more about learning how to exist as a normal person. You know, I remember there was this one time early in our relationship, and I've been in therapy for years, right? And I dropped a glass, and you weren't angry at me. And my brain was like, when's it going to happen though? Where's the abuse? It's coming. And that wasn't because I didn't trust you. It wasn't because I felt unsafe around you. But it's almost these responses that are almost embedded into the way that you feel, the way that you work. And a lot of traditional trauma therapy doesn't work for people with CPTSD because it's not about these cognitive distortions. You know, a lot of the ways that you think, like, so for example, I have a friend, right? And every time someone doesn't respond to her for quite a long period of time, she thinks they've died, right? You take that to maybe CBT therapist, and they'd be like, oh, that's a cognitive distortion, but that's happened to her like 5 times. And so that's actually a really reasonable fear. And so trying to work through kind of a cognitive distortion in that way, or seeing it as a cognitive distortion, isn't mindful of actually the reality that might be for that person's situation. You know, oftentimes with CPTSD, it's about bottom-up therapy instead of top-down. It's not about changing your thoughts so that your feelings change. It's about making you feel safe and acknowledging the fear and the trauma that you hold within your body and you hold within your emotions. And then from that, once you've created that sense of safety, once you've, you know, it's things like somatic therapy, movement, all these other things to help you feel safe in your body again and feel like your body's yours, actually, especially if somebody's faced sexual abuse. It can be really powerful, but of course, you still always have that context of trauma. And I think one of the most frustrating things about having kind of CPTSD and having that really objectively traumatic childhood is like when you first meet someone and they're like, not just in a relationship setting, but of course I did have to gently drip feed in the trauma. It's like, I think a friend of mine, it's like Russian nesting dolls. You take them out and there's just more trauma.
Nah, you hid all your red flags, mate. You were just like one at a time.
One at a time.
Popping them out. I was like, oh, it's too late now.
You know, you can't get rid of me now.
It's too late now.
Too late.
But again, you're speaking about therapy, and we slightly differ again on our beliefs on this. Now, I am coming round to the idea that it can be beneficial for certain people, not all people. Like myself, I don't think I would benefit from it, just how my mind is wired to tackle things. But we both know someone who is currently in therapy.
Yeah.
And the previous therapist didn't really do her any good. Like, kind of fucked them up even more.
Yeah.
So how are you going to go about and find someone who won't mind fuck you?
So there's a couple of different aspects. There are so many different modalities, which is different types of therapy. And some of those just won't be helpful for certain people. You know, people think that therapy is just sitting down in a room. It's not. There's loads of different types of therapy. There's music therapy, art therapy, it's equine therapy, which means you run around with horses all day. And a lot of people who, and again, there's different therapies for different mental health conditions. And there's this kind of idea now that everyone needs therapy. And I don't think that's true. There's a lot of commodification, especially on TikTok and all these other sorts of things about what trauma is. And people going, oh, I'm so traumatized. I'm like, no, you're not. You know nothing. And that can be obviously, you know, people can have small t traumas, which are, you know, interpersonal traumas. And that's not the same as objective, genuine, like really complex trauma. But people think that everything's really traumatic now. And that's because that term has kind of been taken out of context. People can face adversity and difficulty, and you might need or might find short-term therapy helpful for someone like that. But therapy isn't for everyone. Not everyone needs to be seeing a therapist. If you have a mental health condition, which will respond to therapy, then you should be going to therapy. If you don't have a mental health condition per se, you can, you know, and again, being sad or being upset or going through difficult emotions is actually a normal part of life. And it's about actually, do you have the coping skills to cope with that yourself? Were you raised in a situation where you were given those coping skills, where you saw those modelled in your parents? That's not directly you, by the way. This is more of a general question. I'm not going, Oliver, do you have all the coping skills that you need to cope with yourself? But there's all these different aspects, and therapy is for helping you process. It's about, and it's different for every person. Not everybody needs therapy, and therapy isn't right for everyone. But the reason that somebody doesn't go to therapy shouldn't be because they think that this shouldn't be because of stigma. It shouldn't be because they feel embarrassed about talking about their feelings. It should be that actually I have other coping mechanisms that work really well for me and that enable me to live a full life. If you're not living a full life, if you're reliant on substances to get through the day, if you're contemplating suicide, then you're not functioning at your best self. And obviously I don't sit here as a mental health professional who's a trained counsellor, but not everyone needs therapy. And that's okay. But it's about making sure that when somebody does seek therapy, that they're not treated like an outcast, that people don't tell them, oh, you shouldn't talk to anyone about your emotions because that's embarrassing. All of this other sort of stigma isn't what prevents them. And if they do feel like they need it, that they have access to that therapy. And unfortunately, under the NHS in its current state, a lot of people don't have access to the therapy they need, and people don't have access to that therapy at an early enough stage for it to be beneficial for them. And sometimes they're on a waiting list for so long that they either kill themselves, or they seek private therapy, or they just get worse and worse and worse until by the time they go to therapy, they are so unwell that they aren't able to engage with that kind of tier 2, again, thinking about the tiers, level of therapy, and they need to go up and up and up. And then there's all these waiting lists and it gets really messy. But and this sounds really bad saying this as somebody who works within the NHS, but actually, especially for adults, I don't recommend going to the NHS for therapy if you can avoid it. If you have to, then you have to. But if you can afford that therapy privately, it would be much better actually for you. You have more choice, you have more options about who you go to and what kind of therapy you receive. And if you don't have somebody who's helping you, and it's about just how therapy is making you feel, if it's not making you feel better, if it's not helping you, then you don't just need to keep on going to that therapist because, oh, I need therapy and everyone's telling me I need therapy, I need to keep on going. It's okay to, but if you're going privately, you can go, actually, I don't like it, I'm going somewhere else. But that's not so much of an option if you're within the NHS, and also the waiting lists and all these other sorts of, people often don't seek help until they're near crisis point. And then the NHS goes, can you wait another 6 months? Another couple of years? You'll be fine. Just deal with it.
Yeah, I think that's the same with doctors, though.
Yeah.
They're not... Everyone is it is like brought up and trained to go to the doctor when something's wrong.
Yeah.
And never to think about the prevention in the first place, or how to keep healthy, to not need to go to the hospital as much or see the doctor. And it can be the same for mental health as well, about not getting into the point where you now need to go to therapy or you're pretty bad.
I think the difficulty also is that healthcare is designed for the masses, right? It's designed to meet the needs of as much of the population as it can. And unfortunately, that's not going to work for everyone. And you also can reach a point where you become too complex for those services. And that's something that I've really experienced that could be a really difficult thing for especially people who have complex PTSD or other complex mental health difficulties, where the services that exist aren't suitable for them because they're almost too unwell, or they're unwell in the wrong way for them to access service. It can be same for physical health as well. Somebody with a chronic illness, I avoid A&E like a plague. I will not go to it unless I genuinely think I'm about to die. And even then, I'll call 111 and be like, they'll be like, you need to go to A&E because we think you've got a concussion. I was like, oh, can I go to the GP next week? Because I'm just aware that those services that are there are not for people like me, and that I'll go in and they won't help me, they won't make me feel any better. And obviously there are, if you can avoid it, but it's, again, I won't die if I don't go to hospital, right? If for somebody who would die if they don't go to hospital, if they have a condition that threatens their life in that way, then they have to go and they don't have that option. It's the same with the NHS, you don't, when you're at that point where you need that help, especially with mental health, that's why a lot of these crisis services exist, and you're meant to, and then that's where you access. And this is something I've talked about multiple times in suicide prevention work, in strategic work, where there's this really big trough of help. You can wait 6 months to a year for 6 sessions of CBT, or you are about to kill yourself literally in an hour's time, and there's not so much in between, and that's where the difficulty lies. And so what happens is that people who have those more complex mental health difficulties, or those more complex health difficulties, end up using those crisis services when they get to that worst point, and then when they're not dying immediately anymore, the NHS goes, see you later, and then doesn't help them. And that's not the fault of the wonderful doctors and nurses and all these other sorts of things. This is systemic. And sometimes when, I went to a conference a while back where the NHS was described as geriatric, and, that it's so overlapped on itself and it's so messed up now. And that's not a criticism of, I love my job, and I know, and I'm really fond of all my colleagues, and I know we all try really hard to do the best that we can. But it's a broken system, and it doesn't matter how good intentions or how good the intentions are of somebody working within that system if that system is not designed in a way that helps people. And that's why I do the work that I do with NHS England, to try and direct where things are actually going to go next from here. So exciting.
Do you believe we're in a mental health epidemic?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, and young people now are very unwell, actually. Things are worse than they have been before. And I guess sometimes it's difficult to really specify whether, is it that young people are more unwell than they used to be, or is it that they're seeking help? Because people committed suicide, 20, 30 years ago.
I think the rates are a lot higher. They're probably at their highest, I would say. I
agree, but it's also the matter of how much existed previous, and this especially with autism diagnosis is especially what I'm thinking of here. People are like, oh my God, so many more people are getting diagnosed with autism now. It's like, and what we have to remember is that the people who access services isn't the same as the amount of people who exist, and how many people are there who previously wouldn't have accessed services, or why are people more, and yes, we know that people are more unwell now, and COVID, I still see the impacts of the COVID lockdown and everything that happened there on people's mental health. It completely shook people out of their day-to-day lives. It was a collective trauma that affected a lot of people, and especially for a lot of autistic people, it really interrupted their routine, which autistic people, we like routine. And having that understanding, there's still all, and social media and the internet, and also with things have moved so quickly, and I don't feel like actually the world that we're in now is one that our bodies and our minds were designed for. We weren't designed for constant consumption of social media. We weren't designed for 40-hour work weeks. We were designed to ooga booga around a forest and stab elephants and stuff. And that's what our bodies were built for. That's what our minds were built for. And I feel like one of the reasons why a lot of these mental health difficulties are coming up now, and especially things like neurodiversities and disabilities, the stress is just getting more and more and more on people, and the world's all falling to shit, and it's affecting people. You know, somebody with a chronic illness like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is what I have, you know, going back long enough, they might have just been, you know, the frail. I was born to be a frail Victorian woman, you know, living in respite on the seaside and in bed all day. That's what I was built for. And I'm in a modern world which has very high expectations, you know, and especially when women and men are both expected to work, and then that's the only way to afford things nowadays, all these other sorts of things. There's so many, I think, societal impacts and environmental impacts that have really ruined mental and physical health. And if I could change it, I would.
Yeah, I think social media is one of the biggest ones for it, like connecting with anyone across the world instantly, whether that be a positive or negative interaction.
I remember there was, I think it was when I was doing some work about 4 or 5 years ago for the eating disorders team. I was interviewing one of their band 6 nurses, which is like a mid-level staff nurse, and there was all these posters about social media, and I think like eating disorders in comparison and appearance is a really big one. Like, you know, go back enough years, the sexiest person you would have seen 300 years ago would have been the very dirty woman with very nice hair within your village. You know, the top 0.1% of most attractive people, you wouldn't even see them. You wouldn't even know what they looked like. And the standards of beauty and the standards of expectation as to what you're meant to look like and what bodies were meant to look like were completely different. And now we're in a time where people with plastic surgery, that, you know, the Victoria's Secret angels, the people who are unattainable, are everywhere. You can see them all the time now, and the expectations that sets for young girls as to what you're meant to look like, you know, what people look like, and also social media lies about what you're meant to look like. You know, people will pose very nicely for social media, and that'll be and you'll think that's what they look like all the time, and you won't see what they look like having emerged from bed, you know, like I do usually most weekends, looking like I've just been, you know, sat in a window.
That bold glamour on TikTok, mate, that should be illegal.
It's scary. And like AI and all these other sorts of things that show about how like appearance and social media, and even, you know, like posing your body, you can trick the camera. It's all these other sorts of things, and we don't see. And I think society is taking a move back to desiring that again. Now we want to see more real people and real bodies. But that's not, you know, what you see. And when you're scrolling on social media, you see all these different people that you'd never bump into. And again, you know, it's all of these things with, you know, you compare yourself. And I think social media has given so many people community, especially people who are autistic or people who have, you know, who are a part of quite niche and small communities that maybe they wouldn't bump into each other in real life. That gives you that sense of connection, and that can be really powerful. And I don't like it when people are like, oh, boo-boo, social media, it's all awful. But there's about responsible use of social media and responsible use of the internet, and the fact that it wasn't... Technology is advancing so quickly now, and there's constantly this push to be more innovative and do new things. And you know what? I would just want to sit in a corner, read a book, drink my hot chocolate, and stare out into the seaside. And your mental health would be a lot better if you did that all the time. But it's addictive. And there's also, this is something I noticed with my little brother recently, actually, just how available people are. I think that's a real impact on a lot of people's mental health. If his friend, if he doesn't text back his friend in like an hour, they'll be like, where are you? Why aren't you speaking to me? And that's even a small generational difference. People are even more, like teenagers are really available now, and they get in trouble with each other if they're not constantly available. I'll be like, oh, sorry, babe, didn't respond to you in like a day. Sorry, I was asleep, or I was distracted by something else. I was like petting the cat and forgot to look at my phone. But
that's the difference. I don't need constant communication. Yeah. I just crack on with my tasks and my goals, and it's just, I'm like, oh, Rowan's messaged me. It's been like 2 days.
I miss you more than that. But yeah, I know what you mean. But it's even with friends of mine, you know, a lot of my friends, sometimes I won't speak to a friend of mine for like a week, and we'll be like, oh, sorry, I've been really busy. How are you? And still, it's about making that effort to still connect. But I think my brother did that, like, and he's 14, 15. That's not what's socially acceptable anymore. You're meant to constantly be available. And the amount of times I just let my phone run out of battery and go, I'm just going to have a little kip. And if anyone messages me, they can wait. But I think that's actually not necessarily normal. A lot of people are expected to be constantly available. And, things like the phone, you can just ignore the phone ringing. But texts and things like that, people will expect you to respond, and you're expected to be constantly available. And I'm just like, no, if I respond to you, it's because I remembered. Luckily enough, you see me frequently enough in person that I can't completely avoid you. So you actually need to text you back.
But it's a thing, like a lot of younger people, they don't like making calls, don't like answering calls.
You don't like answering calls either. If it's from me, you want me to text you.
Yeah, it's just easier.
I know, but
if it's work, I'm always answering the phone.
I know, it's because it's business.
It's business, higher priorities.
Yeah, I see where I stand. But yeah, it's about, and I do like texting, but I actually really like a good call, especially for friends that I have from quite far away. Like my best friend lives up in York, and so to see her just text her all the time, we do try and call, but we have a problem because if we call, we'll sometimes be on the phone for like 4 or 5 hours, and it's like, oh my god, where's all the time gone? And I think people are either drains or radiators socially. I'm not sure if you've heard that theory around.
Yeah.
But some people just bring you energy and make you feel vitalized when you speak to them. There are some people who are like, oh my god, when can this phone call end? I think
it's a man thing, because my phone calls last 30 seconds if you're lucky.
Yeah,
cool. You're good,
like
my guy. Yeah, sweet.
Love talking.
That is it. But
it's if it's a business call, I'm like, I'm not going to cope that way. But if it's someone that I get on with, I can just talk.
Yeah, but I think to wrap up, there's an epidemic, I would say, in mental health. Now, there's a massive epidemic in obesity.
Yeah.
You may not know the answer to this question. What are the government doing to help with the epidemic of mental health? Because obesity's not got better, it's got worse. And we've known about that for a while, about the epidemic with that.
Well, I could go into my political views about this current government, and I'm going to spare you of that because we are wrapping up and I'm not going to rant about it all. The answer is not enough. The NHS is trying its best, but the NHS, there's been a lot of recruitment freeze and certain things. A lot of the NHS is being really underfunded, and so a lot of the stuff that we need is we're not getting. And it's a lot about the government are trying to show that they've done stuff and be like, oh look, we did this new thing, we've introduced this new innovative thing. It's like, and not to like this whole thing that the NHS like, oh, we're taking trans people off single sex calls. I'm like, I don't care. People can't even get into a hospital bed. Does this shit matter? Not really. Is it that deep? And things like that, where they want to have these wins to show people, look, we've made a change, we've made a difference. Look, we've put all the calories on menus to make sure that people eat less food. It's like, or you're just affecting people with eating disorders who now can't leave the house and eat anywhere. Like, I think a lot, and this can be an issue within the NHS and with other entities as well. Sometimes it's a lot more about showing that you've done something rather than actually making genuine change. And that, I think, is the biggest issue that we're having, that they're not invested in genuine change. They're invested in looking like they've changed something and made things better.
Now, if there's one message you could leave the people with, what would it be?
Be nice to people and be nice to yourself. There are so many crap things that are going on in the world, and I'm a real believer that radical kindness and there's a really good book I think called What We Owe to Each Other, and in a world where there is so much pain and strife and all these other really shit things, having compassion for the people around you and just choosing to be kind and choosing to be nice is an act of rebellion. So do that.
Perfect.